In a world where social media has made everyone believe they can get away with anything, where tourists think foreign laws don't apply to them, and where a single moment of disrespect can destroy an entire life, one man's split-second decision would become a cautionary tale heard around the globe. What happens when an entitled American tourist, drunk on vacation confidence and armed with nothing but ignorance, decides to challenge one of the most respected institutions in British history? The answer lies in a story so shocking, so brutal in its consequences, that it would make international headlines and serve as a permanent reminder that some lines should never be crossed. This is not just another travel mishap or cultural misunderstanding. This is the story of how 30 seconds of stupidity led to a nightmare that would haunt multiple families forever. A story where privilege meets reality, where disrespect encounters justice, and where one man's fatal mistake would change everything for everyone involved. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle, as Marcus Thompson adjusted his expensive camera strap and checked his reflection in his phone screen one more time. At 28, Marcus embodied everything that frustrated locals about certain American tourists. His designer sneakers squeaked against the ancient stones, his voice carried louder than necessary across the courtyard, and his entire demeanor screamed entitlement wrapped in a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. Marcus had arrived in London 3 days earlier as part of what he liked to call his European Conquest Tour, a month-long journey funded by his father's tech company Success. He wasn't just any tourist. He was a social media influencer with 250,000 followers who hung on his every word and watched his every move through carefully curated Instagram stories and TikTok videos. His content focused on living the luxury life and showing the world how it's done, which primarily consisted of him flashing money, making fun of local customs, and generally behaving like the world existed for his entertainment. The past few days in London had been typical Marcus behavior. He'd complained loudly about the food at a Michelin-starred restaurant, demanded special treatment at the Tower of London because of his influencer status, and had already posted several videos mocking what he called British stuffiness. His followers loved it. The comments were filled with laughing emojis and Americans agreeing that Europeans needed to lighten up and learn how to have fun. Windsor Castle represented the perfect backdrop for his next viral moment. Marcus had spent the previous evening researching the changing of the guard ceremony, not out of respect or genuine interest, but to figure out how to create the most engaging content. He'd read about the Queen's Guard, their stoic nature, their dedication to remaining motionless and silent regardless of provocation. To Marcus, this wasn't admirable discipline. It was a challenge. These guys are basically living statues, he'd told his phone camera the night before from his luxury hotel room overlooking the Thames. Tomorrow I'm going to see just how far I can push them before they break character. This is going to be epic content, guys. Make sure you're following my story because this is going to be legendary. His plan was simple but showed a complete lack of understanding about what he was dealing with. Marcus intended to gradually escalate his behavior around the guards, filming their reactions or lack thereof, building up to what he called the ultimate test of their robot programming. He'd brought props, a small speaker to play music, silly string, and even a rubber chicken. In his mind, this was harmless fun that would entertain his audience while showing these uptight Brits how to laugh at themselves.
The morning had started perfectly according to his script.
Marcus positioned himself near the guard station where Officer James Morrison stood at attention. Morrison, 34 years old and a 10-year veteran of the Queen's Guard, represented everything Marcus failed to understand about duty, honor, and service. Morrison had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, lost friends to roadside bombs, and carried emotional scars that would never fully heal. Standing guard wasn't just a job for him. It was a sacred duty that connected him to centuries of tradition and sacrifice. Morrison's uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. His bearskin hat sat at precisely the correct angle, and his rifle was held with the exact posture drilled into him through months of training. Behind the motionless exterior, Morrison was completely aware of his surroundings. He noticed the gathering crowd, the excited whispers of genuine tourists, and the obnoxious American with the expensive camera who seemed to be treating the ceremony like a personal performance. Marcus began his performance slowly, narrating to his phone camera while gradually moving closer to Morrison. Okay, guys, here we have one of the famous British Guards. They're supposed to never move, never react, never break character no matter what happens. Let's see if that's really true. The first few minutes involved Marcus making faces at Morrison, waving his hands dramatically, and speaking in an exaggerated British accent that made nearby tourists cringe with embarrassment. Morrison, trained for exactly these situations, remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his breathing controlled and steady. This was nothing new. Tourists tested guards regularly, and professionalism always prevailed. But Marcus interpreted Morrison's professionalism as weakness, his discipline as a game to be won. The comments on his livestream were encouraging him to go further, to be bolder, to really show that robot who's boss. The validation from his online audience fed his ego and clouded what little judgment he possessed. "This guy is like a machine," Marcus told his camera, moving even closer. "I don't think he's even human. Maybe British people are just born without emotions." The nearby crowd was beginning to shift uncomfortably, sensing that something was building toward a dangerous climax. Marcus pulled out his portable speaker and began playing loud music, holding it inches from Morrison's face. Still no reaction. The rubber chicken came next, squeaking and honking as Marcus waved it around Morrison's head. A few tourists started to leave, uncomfortable with the disrespectful display. Parents pulled their children closer, sensing the shift in atmosphere from playful tourism to something darker. Throughout this escalation, Morrison remained a study in perfect self-control. His training had prepared him for harassment, for attempts to make him break character, for tourists who mistook his professionalism for weakness. But his training had also taught him that there were lines that, once crossed, demanded a response. His fellow guards were watching from their positions, ready to react if necessary, but hoping that this particular tourist would eventually get bored and move on like most did. Marcus, however, had no intention of moving on. His viewer count was climbing, the comments were going wild, and he felt like he was on the verge of creating his most viral content ever. He pulled out the silly string, spraying it across Morrison's uniform while laughing and encouraging his audience to share the stream with their friends. "Look at this guy," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing across the courtyard. "He's like a wax figure. Hey, statue boy, can you hear me in there? Are you even alive?" The silly string had left colorful streaks across Morrison's pristine uniform, a uniform that represented not just personal pride but the honor of his regiment, his country, and the memories of fallen comrades. Something shifted in the air around the castle grounds. Other guards tensed almost imperceptibly. Security personnel began moving into better positions. The crowd of tourists grew quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something that had moved far beyond entertainment into dangerous territory. Morrison's jaw tightened by perhaps a millimeter, invisible to Marcus but noticed by his fellow guards who knew him well. Inside Morrison's mind, years of training warred with rising anger. Not anger at being tested or harassed, but anger at the complete disrespect being shown to something sacred, something that represented sacrifice and service that this privileged tourist could never understand. Marcus, oblivious to the warning signs, decided it was time for his grand finale. He had one more escalation planned, one final act that he believed would cement his viral fame and prove once and for all that these guards were just for show. He stepped even closer to Morrison, so close that his breath fogged the polished brass of Morrison's uniform buttons. "Do you know what, guys?" Marcus said to his camera, his voice taking on a nastier edge that his regular followers had never heard before. "I think it's time to really wake this robot up. Time to show him what real Americans think of his little dress-up game." The crowd held its breath. Morrison's fellow guards moved almost imperceptibly into ready positions. Security cameras zoomed in, and Marcus Thompson, drunk on his own arrogance and completely unaware that he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return, prepared to make the fatal mistake that would destroy his life and change everything for everyone watching. The silence that fell over Windsor Castle was different from the respectful quiet that usually accompanied the ceremony. This was the silence that comes just before thunder, just before the storm breaks, just before everything changes forever. In that moment of perfect stillness, with hundreds of people watching and thousands more viewing through Marcus's livestream, the stage was set for a confrontation that would make international headlines and serve as a permanent reminder that some institutions, some traditions, and some people command respect whether you understand why or not. Marcus raised his head, drew back, and prepared to spit directly in the face of a man who had served his country with honor, who had stood guard over the traditions that defined a nation, and who was about to teach one entitled American tourist the hardest lesson of his privileged life. The glob of saliva hit Officer James Morrison squarely in the face, sliding down his cheek and dripping onto his immaculate red uniform. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, everything stopped. The tourists gasped in collective horror. The security cameras captured every detail in high definition. Marcus's livestream viewer count skyrocketed as word spread across social media that something terrible was happening at Windsor Castle. But it was Morrison's reaction that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. The man who had remained perfectly still through 10 minutes of harassment, who had maintained his composure through music blasting, silly string attacks and verbal abuse, finally moved. Not with the explosive anger that might have been expected, but with something far more frightening. Cold, controlled, military precision. Morrison's head turned slowly toward Marcus, his grey eyes locking onto the American's face with an intensity that made several tourists step backward involuntarily. When Morrison spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, and carried the weight of absolute authority. "Sir, you have just committed assault upon a representative of Her Majesty's Guard. You will not move. You will not speak.
You will remain exactly where you are until the proper authorities arrive."
Marcus, still holding his phone and grinning at his camera, seemed to think this was part of the show.
Did you guys see that? I finally broke him. The robot is talking. His laughter echoed across the courtyard, a sound that would haunt him in the weeks to come when he realized what he had actually done. What Marcus didn't understand, what his research had completely failed to reveal, was that spitting on a member of the Queen's Guard wasn't just disrespectful behavior. Under British law, it constituted assault on a Crown servant, a serious criminal offence that carried significant penalties. More importantly, it triggered security protocols that had been developed over decades to protect both the guards and the monarchy they represented. Within seconds, Morrison's signal had been received by the other guards stationed around the castle. In movements so coordinated they seemed choreographed, 6 additional guards began converging on Marcus's position. These weren't ceremonial positions anymore. They had shifted into active security mode, and their training had prepared them for exactly this situation. Marcus finally began to sense that something was wrong when he noticed the other guards moving. "Hey, wait a minute," he said to his camera, his voice losing some of its cocky confidence. "This is just a prank, guys. It's just for fun." But the guards weren't stopping, and the crowd of tourists was backing away, creating a circle around Marcus that felt more like a trap than an audience. The first to reach Marcus was Sergeant William Hayes, a 15-year veteran whose face showed no emotion whatsoever as he approached the American tourist. Hayes had seen action in Iraq and Kosovo, had lost men under his command, and had zero tolerance for disrespect toward the institution he had dedicated his life to serving. "Sir," Hayes said in a voice that could have cut glass, "you are under citizen's arrest for assault upon a Crown servant. You will place your hands behind your back and cease all recording immediately." Marcus's phone was still live streaming, broadcasting his growing panic to thousands of viewers around the world. "This is crazy. I didn't assault anyone. It was just a joke." But his protests fell on deaf ears as Hayes expertly relieved him of his phone and ended the live stream that had been documenting his descent from arrogant prankster to criminal defendant. The Metropolitan Police arrived within minutes, their response time reflecting both the serious nature of the offence and the high-profile location where it had occurred. Chief Inspector Sarah Williams, a 20-year veteran of the force, took immediate control of the situation. She had dealt with unruly tourists before, but something about this case struck her as different. The American's complete lack of understanding about what he had done, combined with the very public nature of his offence, suggested this would become a much larger issue than a simple tourist misbehaviour case. "Mr. Thompson," Inspector Williams said, reading from the identification found in Marcus's wallet, "you are under arrest for assault upon a Crown servant, public order offences, and disturbing the peace. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." Marcus's face went white as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his entitled worldview. "Look, officer, this is all a big misunderstanding. I'm an American citizen. I have rights. I was just making content for my social media. These guys are supposed to be like street performers, right? I didn't know spitting was such a big deal here." Inspector Williams exchanged a look with Sergeant Hayes that spoke volumes about their shared opinion of Marcus's defence. "Mr. Thompson, you have just admitted on record to intentionally committing assault upon a representative of the Crown. Street performers they are not, sir. You have attacked a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard, and you will be processed according to the full extent of British law." As the handcuffs clicked into place around Marcus's wrists, Officer Morrison finally allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Not because he enjoyed seeing someone arrested, but because justice was being served for an act of disrespect that went far beyond personal insult. Morrison wiped the spit from his face with a handkerchief, straightened his uniform, and returned to his post. His duty continued, regardless of what had just happened. The crowd of tourists who had witnessed the entire incident were interviewed by police as potential witnesses. Most were horrified by what they had seen, describing Marcus's behavior as increasingly aggressive and completely inappropriate. Several mentioned that they had been considering leaving because his actions made them uncomfortable long before the spitting incident occurred. Mrs. Bedside, Mrs. Carr, Eleanor Davies, a retired teacher from Wales who had been visiting with her grandchildren, summed up the sentiment of most witnesses. That young man showed complete disrespect for everything these guards represent. My grandfather served in the Second World War, and to see someone treat our servicemen like that was absolutely disgusting. He got exactly what he deserved. As Marcus was led away to the police vehicle, he continued protesting his innocence and demanding that someone contact the American embassy. "This is going to cause an international incident," he shouted. "You can't treat American citizens like this." But his protests only served to demonstrate how completely he had misunderstood both the seriousness of his offense and the legal system he was now entering. The police van doors closed with a finality that Marcus was only beginning to appreciate. Through the small window, he watched Windsor Castle disappear behind him, along with any hope that this might still be treated as a simple misunderstanding. The ancient stones of the castle had witnessed centuries of history, and now they had witnessed the moment when one man's arrogance finally met consequences he couldn't buy, influence, or social media his way out of. Inspector Williams rode in the passenger seat, already making notes about the case that would soon consume much of her time. She had seen enough entitled tourists to recognize the type, but something about Marcus Thompson's complete disconnect from reality suggested this case would become more complicated than a simple assault charge. His social media presence, his obvious wealth, and his absolute certainty that American citizenship would protect him from British law all pointed toward a defense strategy that would likely involve expensive lawyers, diplomatic pressure, and media attention. But what Marcus didn't yet understand was that British law applied equally to everyone within British territory, regardless of nationality or social media following. The Crown Prosecution Service would review his case based purely on the evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming. Not only had hundreds of people witnessed his assault on Officer Morrison, but he had live-streamed the entire incident, creating a permanent record of his criminal behavior. As the police vehicle wound through London traffic toward the station where Marcus would be processed, he sat in stunned silence for the first time all day. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate his privileged bubble. He wasn't in America, where his father's money and connections could make problems disappear. He wasn't dealing with some small-town security guard who might be impressed by his social media following. He was now a criminal defendant in a foreign country facing serious charges, with no understanding of the legal system he had just entered, and no appreciation for the cultural values he had violated. The wheels of British justice had begun turning, and Marcus Thompson was about to discover that some mistakes can't be undone, some lines can't be uncrossed, and some consequences can't be avoided, regardless of how many followers you have or how much money your father has made. His fatal mistake was about to become a lesson that would echo far beyond his own life, teaching anyone willing to listen that respect isn't optional, traditions matter, and actions have consequences, even when you think you're just making content for social media. The police station loomed ahead, its imposing brick facade representing the first stop on Marcus's journey through a legal system that would show him no special consideration for his nationality, his wealth, or his complete failure to understand the gravity of what he had done. Justice, as he was about to learn, doesn't care about your social media following. The custody suite at Paddington Green Police Station buzzed with its usual controlled chaos as Marcus Thompson was processed through the system that would dominate his life for the foreseeable future. The sterile fluorescent lighting harsh against his face as his personal belongings were catalogued and sealed in evidence bags. His expensive watch, designer wallet, and the phone that had broadcast his downfall to the world were all carefully documented and stored away. Custody Sergeant Robert Mitchell had seen thousands of arrestees pass through his station over the years, but something about the American sitting across from him sparked particular irritation. Perhaps it was Marcus's continued insistence that this was all a massive overreaction, or his repeated demands to speak to someone in charge who could sort this mess out. Mitchell had dealt with enough entitled criminals to recognize the type, but Marcus's complete inability to grasp the seriousness of his situation was remarkable even by those standards. "Mr. Thompson," Sergeant Mitchell said as he completed the booking paperwork, "you'll be held in custody until your court appearance tomorrow morning. You've been offered legal representation, which I strongly advise you to accept, and you've been permitted to contact the American Embassy. Is there anything else you need to understand about your current situation?" Marcus slumped in the plastic chair, his designer clothes wrinkled and stained from the day's events. "I need to understand why you people are treating me like a terrorist for what was obviously a harmless prank. Don't you have real criminals to worry about? This is insane." The duty solicitor who had been assigned to Marcus's case, Jennifer Walsh, arrived an hour later to find her client in a state of aggressive denial that would make mounting any reasonable defense extremely difficult. Walsh had been practicing criminal law for 12 years and had represented everyone from petty thieves to violent offenders, but she had rarely encountered someone so completely disconnected from the reality of their legal situation.
Mr. Bringbay, the defense story that
"Thompson," she began, settling into the consultation room across from Marcus. "I've reviewed the initial charges against you, and I need you to understand that this is an extremely serious matter. Assault upon a Crown servant is not a minor offence in British law. The maximum penalty could include significant jail time and a criminal record that will follow you for the rest of your life." Marcus leaned back in his chair with a confidence that Walsh found both astounding and deeply concerning. "Look, lady, I appreciate that you have to go through the motions here, but let's be realistic. I'm an American citizen with a clean record and substantial means. My father has connections in the State Department. This whole thing is going to be sorted out with a phone call and maybe a small fine. I just need you to expedite the process so I can get back to my vacation." Walsh set down her pen and looked directly at Marcus with the patience that comes from years of dealing with delusional clients. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. British law does not recognize special treatment based on nationality or wealth. The offence you're charged with carries the same penalties regardless of whether you're American, British, or from anywhere else in the world. Your father's connections, your clean record, and your financial situation will not make these charges disappear." But Marcus wasn't listening. His mind was already working on the narrative he would present to his followers once this misunderstanding was resolved. He could spin this into content about surviving false imprisonment, about standing up to foreign tyranny, about the jealousy that successful Americans faced abroad. His social media following would eat it up. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," Walsh continued, hoping to penetrate his delusion. "Not only did hundreds of people witness your assault on the guard, but you live-streamed the entire incident. You created a permanent record of yourself committing the crime." The prosecution's case is essentially bulletproof. For the first time since his arrest, Marcus's confidence wavered slightly. "But I was just making content. It was entertainment. Surely that has to count for something. Intent matters, right?" Walsh sighed deeply. This was going to be a long case. "Mr. Thompson, intent does matter in criminal law, but not in the way you think. The fact that you planned and filmed your assault on the guard actually makes your case worse, not better. It demonstrates premeditation and shows that you intended to commit the acts that constitute the offense." Meanwhile, news of Marcus's arrest was spreading rapidly across both traditional media and social platforms. The video of his livestream had been downloaded and shared thousands of times before the police could end his broadcast. News outlets across Britain were picking up the story, with headlines like "American tourist assaults Royal Guard" and "Social media influencer arrested at Windsor Castle," dominating the evening news cycle. The story had all the elements that modern media craved: privilege meeting comeuppance, social media culture clashing with ancient tradition, and an American protagonist whose complete lack of self-awareness made him the perfect villain for British audiences. Commentary shows were already booking experts to discuss the incident, with most expressing amazement at Marcus's behaviour and satisfaction at his arrest. Back at Windsor Castle, Officer Morrison had completed his shift and was finally able to discuss the day's events with his colleagues. In the guards' common room, the atmosphere was one of grim satisfaction rather than celebration. These men understood better than most the weight of tradition and duty, and seeing someone treat their service with such contempt had affected them all. "I've had tourists try to get reactions before," Morrison told his fellow guards over cups of tea that had grown cold as they discussed the incident. Kids making faces, people taking selfies, the occasional drunk trying to be funny. But this was different. This was pure disrespect. Filmed for entertainment. "He treated our service like it was a joke." Sergeant Hayes nodded grimly. "The worst part was how he seemed to think nationality would protect him, like being American meant British law didn't apply to him." The entitled arrogance was breathtaking. The conversation was interrupted by a call from their commanding officer, Colonel David Hartwell, who had been dealing with media inquiries about the incident all afternoon. "Gentlemen," he said as he entered the room, "I want you to know that the palace is fully supporting the prosecution of this case. This individual's behavior was not just an assault on Officer Morrison personally, but an attack on the institution we all serve. We will not be accepting any apologies or settlements. This goes to court. Colonel Hartwell's words carried particular weight because they represented official palace policy. When someone attacked a member of the Queen's Guard, they attacked the monarchy itself, and the royal household did not take such offences lightly. This meant that Marcus would face the full force of the British legal system without any hope of the charges being quietly dropped or reduced through diplomatic intervention. As evening fell over London, Marcus sat in his cell, trying to process the day's events. The concrete walls and metal toilet were a far cry from his luxury hotel room, and the reality of his situation was finally beginning to penetrate his privileged worldview. His phone calls to his father had gone unanswered. Robert Thompson was in meetings in Silicon Valley and completely unaware of his son's situation. The American embassy had been contacted, but their response had been far from what Marcus expected. Rather than immediately demanding his release, the embassy official who spoke with Walsh had been professionally polite but clear that they could not and would not interfere with the British legal process. American citizens abroad were subject to local laws, and the embassy's role was limited to ensuring he received fair treatment, not to getting him out of legal trouble. But surely they can do something, Marcus had insisted when Walsh relayed the embassy's position. What's the point of having an embassy if they can't help American citizens? Walsh's response had been patient but firm. Mr. Thompson, embassies exist to ensure fair treatment under local law, not to provide immunity from it. If you had been denied legal representation or mistreated in custody, they would intervene. But you committed a crime in British territory and you will be tried under British law. As the night wore on, Marcus finally began to understand that his situation was not going to be resolved with a phone call or a diplomatic intervention. He was genuinely facing criminal charges in a foreign country, with evidence against him that he had created himself, and with legal representation that seemed more interested in preparing for trial than in making the problem disappear. The cell was cold, the mattress thin, and the sounds of the custody suite continued throughout the night as other prisoners were brought in and processed. For perhaps the first time in his privileged life, Marcus Thompson was experiencing consequences that he couldn't escape through wealth, connections, or charm. The morning would bring his first court appearance, where he would face a magistrate who had seen enough entitled defendants to be utterly unimpressed by his nationality, his social media following, or his family's money. Justice, as Marcus was beginning to learn, was remarkably deaf to the excuses of those who believed themselves above the law. His fatal mistake was becoming a very expensive education, in the reality that some actions have consequences that can't be bought, influenced, or social mediated away. The wheels of the British legal system continued to turn, grinding slowly but inexorably toward a reckoning that would change Marcus Thompson's life forever. The Westminster Magistrates' Court was buzzing with unusual activity as news crews and photographers gathered outside the imposing Victorian building. Word had spread that the American tourist who had assaulted a royal guard would be making his first court appearance, and the media interest was intense. Inside the building, Marcus Thompson sat in the dock wearing clothes that had been brought from his hotel, looking remarkably smaller and more vulnerable than he had appeared in his confident social media videos. District Judge Elizabeth Pemberton had presided over thousands of cases during her 15-year career on the bench, but she had rarely seen such clear-cut evidence of guilt, combined with such apparent disconnect from reality on the part of the defendant. She had reviewed the case file the previous evening and watched the livestream video that had captured Marcus's assault on Officer Morrison in high-definition detail. Mr. Thompson, Judge Pemberton said as she opened the proceedings, you are charged with assault upon a Crown servant, contrary to Section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988, and with causing harassment, alarm, or distress contrary to Section 5 of the Public Order Act 1986. Do you understand these charges? Marcus stood awkwardly in the dock, still clearly expecting this to be resolved quickly. Your Honor, I understand the charges, but I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about what happened yesterday. I was making entertainment content for my social media followers and things got taken out of context. Jennifer Walsh, his solicitor, visibly cringed at her client's response. They had spent an hour that morning discussing the importance of simply acknowledging the charges without attempting to justify his behavior, but Marcus had clearly decided to ignore her advice. Judge Pemberton's expression remained neutral, but those familiar with her courtroom manner would have recognized the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated growing impatience. Mr. Thompson, this is not a trial on the merits of your case. This is a preliminary hearing to address the charges and determine bail conditions. How do you plead to the charges as read? The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor David Sterling, had prepared their case with the thoroughness that such a high-profile matter demanded. Sterling was known for his methodical approach and his particular skill in prosecuting assault cases. He had reviewed not only the live-stream video but also statements from dozens of witnesses and security camera footage from multiple angles around Windsor Castle. "Your Honour," Sterling said, when called upon to present the prosecution's position, "this is an exceptionally clear case of deliberate assault upon a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard." The defendant filmed himself escalating his harassment of Officer Morrison over a period of 10 minutes before ultimately spitting directly in the officer's face. "The evidence is overwhelming, and the offence is serious." When asked about bail, Sterling continued, "The Crown opposes bail for several reasons. Mr. Thompson is a foreign national with no ties to this jurisdiction. He has shown complete disrespect for British law and institutions. Most importantly, given his social media presence and the public nature of his offence, we believe there is a significant risk he will attempt to flee the jurisdiction rather than face trial." Marcus's face went pale as he began to understand that the prosecution was arguing he should remain in custody until trial. "Your Honour, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to run away. I have a return ticket to America next week. This is just a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion." Judge Pemberton had heard enough. "Mr. Thompson, you will remain silent unless asked to speak." "Ms. Walsh, what is your client's position regarding bail?" Walsh stood and made the best argument she could under the circumstances. "Your Honour, my client is a first-time offender with no criminal history. While he is a foreign national, he has significant ties to the United States that would prevent him from becoming a fugitive. He is willing to surrender his passport and comply with any reasonable bail conditions the court might impose." But as Walsh spoke, she knew her arguments were weak. Her client's behaviour in court was not helping his case, and his complete failure to show any understanding of the seriousness of his offence was undermining any argument that he could be trusted to comply with bail conditions. Judge Pemberton considered the arguments for several minutes before delivering her decision. "Mr. Thompson, the offence you are charged with is serious, the evidence appears substantial, and your behaviour both at the time of the alleged offence and in this courtroom suggests a troubling disconnect from the gravity of your situation. Given that you are a foreign national with limited ties to this jurisdiction and considering the risk of flight, bail is denied. You will be remanded in custody until your trial date." The gavel came down with a finality that seemed to echo through Marcus's entire worldview. He was led from the dock in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence and demanding that someone contact the American embassy. The reality that he would be spending weeks or months in a British prison while awaiting trial was only beginning to penetrate his consciousness. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was intense. News crews from major British networks were broadcasting live, and social media was exploding with commentary about the case. The general public reaction was overwhelmingly negative toward Marcus, with many expressing satisfaction that an entitled American tourist was finally facing real consequences for disrespectful behaviour. Officer Morrison, who had attended the hearing as the victim and primary witness, spoke briefly to reporters outside the court. His statement was measured and professional, reflecting the dignity that Marcus had attempted to mock. "I'm satisfied that the legal system is working as it should. No one, regardless of nationality, should believe they can assault a member of Her Majesty's Guard without facing appropriate consequences." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Robert Thompson was finally learning about his son's situation. The senior Thompson's initial reaction was the same, entitled outrage, that characterized his son's personality. But unlike Marcus, Robert Thompson had enough business experience to understand when a situation required professional help rather than bluster. Within hours, Robert had retained Chambers & Associates, one of London's most prestigious criminal defence firms, to replace Jennifer Walsh as Marcus's representation. The firm's senior partner, Sir Geoffrey Chambers, was a Queen's Counsel with 40 years of experience defending high-profile clients. If anyone could navigate the British legal system and minimise the damage to Marcus's case, it would be Chambers. Sir Geoffrey's first meeting with Marcus at Belmarsh Prison was an educational experience for both men. The legendary barrister had defended everyone from corrupt politicians to accused terrorists, but he had rarely encountered a client so completely unaware of the reality of his situation. "Mr. Thompson," Sir Geoffrey began in his measured Oxford accent, "I've reviewed your case extensively, and I must be frank with you about your prospects. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Your behaviour was recorded in detail, and you have made several statements that essentially constitute confessions. My job is not to perform miracles, but to minimize the damage and help you understand what you're facing. Marcus, now wearing standard prison clothing and looking notably less confident than he had days earlier, finally seemed ready to listen. But surely there's something we can do. Diplomatic immunity, cultural misunderstanding, first offense, something? Sir Geoffrey's response was patient but firm. Mr. Thompson, you are not a diplomat. Cultural misunderstanding is not a legal defense for assault. And while this is indeed your first offense, that is merely one factor among many that the court will consider. What you need to understand is that you committed a serious crime in full view of hundreds of witnesses while broadcasting it to the world. The British legal system will not be swayed by your nationality or your father's wealth. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Sir Geoffrey explaining the likely penalties Marcus faced and the limited options available for his defence. A guilty plea might result in a somewhat reduced sentence, but prison time was virtually certain. A not guilty plea would likely result in a longer sentence after an inevitable conviction, given the overwhelming evidence against him. As the days passed, Marcus's story continued to dominate British media and social networks. His social media accounts, now managed by his father's crisis communication team, had been scrubbed of the offensive content, but screenshots and recordings of his livestream continued to circulate widely. The incident had become a symbol of entitled tourist behavior and American arrogance, generating discussions about respect for local customs and the consequences of social media culture. Back in America, Marcus's followers were split between those who believed he was being persecuted for being American and those who recognized that his behavior had been completely inappropriate. Many brands that had sponsored his content quietly ended their relationships, unwilling to be associated with someone facing serious criminal charges for such publicly embarrassing behavior. The trial date was set for 6 weeks away, giving Sir Geoffrey time to prepare what defense was possible under the circumstances. But as he reviewed the evidence and interviewed potential witnesses, it became increasingly clear that the prosecution's case was as strong as he had initially feared. The video evidence was damning, the witness testimony was consistent, and Marcus's own statements had essentially admitted his guilt. Marcus Thompson, who had travelled to Britain expecting to create viral content mocking local traditions, now found himself at the centre of a media storm that was destroying his reputation and potentially his future. His fatal mistake was becoming an expensive lesson in the reality that actions have consequences. Respect cannot be demanded but must be earned, and some lines should never be crossed, regardless of how many people might be watching. 6 weeks after his arrest, Marcus Thompson stood in the dock at Southwark Crown Court, a far cry from the confident influencer who had strolled through Windsor Castle believing himself untouchable. The trial had attracted international media attention, with reporters from American networks joining their British counterparts in covering what had become a symbol of the collision between social media culture and traditional institutions. The Honourable Judge Sir Michael Hartwell, no relation to Colonel Hartwell from the Guards, was known throughout the British legal system for his firm but fair approach to sentencing. He had presided over some of the most significant criminal trials of the past decade and was not impressed by celebrity, wealth or nationality when it came to the administration of justice. Crown Prosecutor David Sterling presented his case with devastating efficiency. The live stream video played in court showed every moment of Marcus's escalating harassment of Officer Morrison, culminating in the assault that had brought them all to this courtroom. Witness after witness testified to Marcus's aggressive behavior, his complete disrespect for the ceremony he was interrupting, and the shocking moment when he spat in the face of a man who had served his country with honor. Members of the jury, Sterling said in his closing argument, this case is not about cultural differences or misunderstandings. This is about a young man who believed his wealth and nationality placed him above the law, who treated a serving member of our armed forces as entertainment for his social media followers, and who ultimately committed a serious assault that was captured on video for the world to see. Officer Morrison's testimony was particularly powerful. Speaking in measured tones that reflected his military bearing, he described not just the physical assault, but the deeper violation he had felt as Marcus mocked everything he stood for. My uniform represents something larger than myself, Morrison told the jury. It represents the sacrifice of countless men and women who have served this country. When he spat on me, he spat on all of us. Sir Geoffrey Chambers, despite his legendary skill as a defence barrister, faced an almost impossible task. His client had filmed himself committing the crime, had confessed on camera, and had shown no genuine remorse for his actions. The best Chambers could do was argue for leniency based on Marcus's youth, his lack of criminal history, and his alleged ignorance of British customs. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Sir Geoffrey said in his closing argument, my client is guilty of poor judgment, of cultural insensitivity, and of behaviour that embarrasses us all. But he is a young man far from home who made a terrible mistake in a moment of foolish bravado. He did not set out to commit a crime, but rather to create content for his social media followers, misguided though that effort was. But even Sir Geoffrey's eloquence could not overcome the weight of evidence and the broader implications of the case. Marcus had become a symbol of everything that frustrated ordinary people about influencer culture, entitled tourism, and the assumption that nationality provided immunity from local laws and customs. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on both charges. As the foreman read the verdict, Marcus finally seemed to understand the full gravity of his situation. The confident smirk that had characterized his social media presence was replaced by genuine fear as he faced the prospect of significant prison time in a foreign country. Judge Hartwell's sentencing remarks were measured but firm. "Mr. Thompson, you have been found guilty of a serious assault upon a member of Her Majesty's Guard, committed in full view of the public, and broadcast to thousands of followers on social media. Your behavior was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather the culmination of sustained harassment that you filmed for entertainment purposes." The judge continued, "You have shown little genuine remorse for your actions, instead focusing on the inconvenience to yourself rather than the harm you caused to Officer Morrison and the institution he represents. Your behavior has brought shame not only upon yourself but upon your country, as your actions have been seen by millions around the world as representative of American attitudes toward British traditions and laws." Marcus stood trembling as Judge Hartwell pronounced sentence. "For the assault upon a Crown servant, I sentence you to 18 months in prison. For the public order offence, I sentence you to 6 months to run concurrently. You will serve a minimum of 9 months before being eligible for parole, after which you will be deported from the United Kingdom and banned from returning for 10 years. The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the courtroom and around the world. Marcus was led away to begin his sentence, his dreams of social media stardom replaced by the harsh reality of life in a British prison. His father, who had flown to London for the trial, sat in the gallery with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding that all his money and connections could not undo his son's fatal mistake.
The media reaction was swift and largely supportive of the sentence.
British commentators praised the judge for treating Marcus no differently than any other defendant, while American coverage was split between those who felt the sentence was too harsh and those who believed Marcus had gotten exactly what he deserved. Officer Morrison, who had attended the sentencing, spoke briefly to reporters afterward. "Justice has been served," he said simply. "Perhaps this will serve as a lesson to others about the importance of respecting the institutions and customs of the countries they visit." In the weeks that followed, Marcus's story became a case study in business schools, ethics classes, and social media training programs around the world. His live stream video, preserved in court records, served as a permanent reminder of how quickly privilege can turn to consequence when boundaries are crossed. The impact on Marcus's family was devastating. Robert Thompson's business relationship suffered, as partners and clients questioned his judgment in raising a son who could behave so poorly on the international stage. The family's social standing in their community was irreparably damaged, with many former friends distancing themselves from what they saw as a public embarrassment. Marcus served his full sentence without incident, though his time in prison was a harsh education in humility that his privileged upbringing had never provided. Surrounded by men who had committed crimes born of desperation rather than entitlement, he gradually began to understand the magnitude of his mistake and the pain he had caused, not just to Officer Morrison, but to his own family. Upon his release and deportation, Marcus returned to America a changed man. His social media accounts had been permanently suspended, his influencer career was finished, and his prospects for normal employment were limited by his criminal record and international notoriety. The confident young man who had believed himself untouchable had been replaced by someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, that actions have consequences that can't be escaped through wealth, connections, or social media manipulation. Officer Morrison continued his service with the Queen's Guard, his dignity intact and his dedication to duty unchanged by the events that had briefly made him famous. He rarely spoke about the incident afterward, preferring to let his professional conduct speak for itself. The case of Marcus Thompson became a landmark example of how social media culture could collide catastrophically with traditional institutions, how entitled behavior could lead to life-altering consequences, and how the pursuit of viral content could destroy the very life it was meant to enhance. His fatal mistake served as a permanent warning to others that some boundaries exist for good reason and that crossing them, especially in pursuit of online fame, can cost everything that truly matters. Years later, as Marcus struggled to rebuild his life far from the spotlight he had once craved, the lesson of his story continued to resonate. Respect cannot be bought, traditions matter more than trends, and some mistakes echo for a lifetime. No matter how many followers you once had, or how much money your father might possess. The 30 seconds that had seemed so entertaining to his audience had cost him everything, proving that in the real world, unlike on social media, there is no delete button for consequences.